Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat wrap up. This week I have 4 and a little bit books that I want to talk about, and I'm just going to dive into it, starting with a reread of an old favourite.
Sophie Vlogs.
This is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is one of my favourite books. Just throwing that out there. That's a really hard sentence for me to say because my favourite books are a gazillion lists long, but this is one of them. This is sort of like a mystery. I don't necessarily want to call it a thriller, but I'm not 100% sure genres. But we follow our nameless narrator as she meets a hugely rich man, Maxim de Winter, while she's acting as a lady's maid. They get married, she comes back to Mandalay with him, the estate seems to be haunted by the ghost of his first wife, and as this book progresses you discover that it appears that there was more going on than you might previously have thought. Blah 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 blah. It's wonderful. I actually reread this because I did a podcast episode on it. I'm going to link to that episode down below because I talked a lot about why I love this book in that episode, so I don't want to just like rehash all of that. If you would like an in-depth look at why I love this book, do go listen to that. But essentially, my favourite thing about this is like the reading experience I've had with it. My first level of reading it, I was very much rooting for certain outcomes. My second time reading it, I really began questioning characters that I had not previously questioned. And then my third time reading it, I questioned other characters that I previously had not questioned. And I like that this has lots of complexities, lots of layers. I love the way that Mandalay itself seems to be like it has its own... Oh, I don't know, like the house and the grounds, they have their own personality and they sort of have like an atmosphere that they infuse the text with, and I really enjoy that. Everyone's shady, trust no one, it's really great, I love it. The little tiny extra bit that I have to talk about is I also tried to read Rebecca's Tale by Sally Beauman. I tried to read this immediately upon finishing Rebecca. I didn't get very far in and it annoyed me and I stopped reading it. I think what annoyed me is I didn't love the characterization of people. I only got about 30 or 40 pages in, but already some of this characterization felt very different to the book I had just finished, and a little bit like Sally Beauman is changing people's characters to fit the story she wants to tell. However, my friend read this and absolutely adored it and told me it was fabulous. I would like to hear from you. If you have read this book, did you like it? Did you hate it? Is it worth persevering through? If I'm already annoyed at how characters seem different, will that continue? Does it all work out? Is it worth it? Any of these thoughts would be very appreciated because I don't know whether to just keep it and give it another try slightly later when I don't have Rebecca quite so fresh in my brain, or if I'm just, if it's not very good. Any thoughts you have would be appreciated. After that is The Complete Fairytales by Charles Perrault. This is translated by Christopher Betts. These are some of the really classic fairy tales that we know and love. Stuff like Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. This is like the origin of those, translated from the French. This edition is particularly lovely because it has a number of full-page illustrations in it. I'm just trying to get a good one up for you. So, for example, here's a full double-page illustration from, I think this one's from Cinderella, I think. I really enjoyed this. It was interesting. Some of these, I think when reading original fairy tales, there will always be like an element of like a little bit of misogyny, a little bit of blah, you know, because of the time that these are written in. The first story in this, which was Griselda, very much had that for me. It was very much like, man doesn't believe women are capable of being good, decides to torture and make his wife's life hell, and I was like, oh god, please don't tell me that all of these fairy tales are going to be like this. But they weren't. I really enjoyed sort of reading the original. So some of these, there were elements which I associate with different fairy tales. So there was one fairy tale which really reminded me of Hansel and Gretel, even though it's not Hansel and Gretel fairy tale, that sort of thing. Suffice to say, if you're someone who is interested in fairy tales, retellings, that sort of stuff, but you would like to know more of like the original source, I think this is a really great one. And this edition in particular had a really interesting preface, and I loved the illustrations throughout, and it was a very interesting experience, and I'm very glad that I read it. On to something completely different, I also read The Black Raven by Kathryn Kerr. This is book 2 of the Dragon Mage series, but it's actually book 10 of the Devery cycle. So I have talked about the Devery cycle a number of times previously in the last book chat. I talked about book 1 of the Dragon Mage. Essentially, this is the third cycle within this. Each cycle is 4 books long. They are all connected like that sort of Celtic knot arrangement, whereby there's different strands, but they're all weaved together and they form a whole. They all come back. I'm being informed by her in her introduction that when I reach the end of this series, it's going to tie back into the beginning of the series, and it's going to be very interesting. One other thing that's really great about this series is this repeating lives. That's one way that that knot is built up, because we're following different timelines, but they're the same souls reborn into different bodies. They don't always remember each other, but you see how the actions of a previous life have ramifications for a later life and stuff like that. Where we're at now, I'm really enjoying this cycle. Essentially, the first cycle was really great. The second cycle got a bit sluggish for me. This third cycle is really bringing it back. I'm much more interested in the storylines in this, but also the 2 different timelines that we're exploring in this book seem to affect each other much more than some of the timelines in the second cycle did. And I kind of realised that that's because the second cycle was needed to set up this third cycle. However, now I'm in the third cycle, I am enjoying it a lot more. I will say that Rodri has, his character seems a little bit stagnant at the moment, but also that's not necessarily a complaint, because I got really annoyed with Rodri in the last cycle with his berserker death wish thing. I found that a bit old and boring, so I don't actually mind that, and I'm quite happy to let these other characters and figures take centre stage a little bit more, like Lily and that sort of thing. So I'm essentially really rejuvenated in my enjoyment of this series, and I'm finding it very exciting to continue with. The final book I want to talk about is Tilly and the Book Wanderers by Anna James, which is the first book in the Pages & Co. series. This is a proof copy, it has a lovely cover. Essentially, we follow Tilly, who lives in a bookshop called Pages & Co. with her grandparents. As this book goes on, we discover that Tilly is a book wanderer like her grandparents are, which essentially means that she can go into books and she can have adventures with the characters. Mainly, the 2 characters that crop up a lot in this regards to Tilly is Alice in Wonderland and Anne of Green Gables, which is lovely. As this book continues, there is a mystery element which comes in, which we're exploring more and that sort of thing. I think this is a perfectly lovely, delightful middle grade book. I had a very fun time reading it. It was lovely. My niggles, if I have them, are, number 1, there's a lot of references to classics in this. I'm not 100% sure how much kids will be familiar with them. Me as an adult, when she's referencing stuff like A Little Princess, that sort of thing, like, I'm picking up on all of these references because I have read those books. Stuff like Alice in Wonderland, I'm sure kids will know. Some of the classic references, I'm not 100% sure how much kids are going to be picking up on. But then I might be underestimating what kids are reading, so you know, like, that's not a huge problem. It's just I was reading it and I was just wondering what it's like to read this as a kid. However, I think there's so much interesting, fabulous world building in this that it would be a magical read for a child. There were a couple of moments as well where I was like, if you guys just shared information, things would be easier. But again, you do need to have conflict for there to be a plot. I understand that. So those are 2 things which I'm observing as an adult reader. I think this is an absolutely magical world for a child to go into, and I will definitely be reading the rest of the series, and it's just lovely. Those are all the books I wanted to talk about this time. As per usual, have you read them? Do you have thoughts on them? Would you like to share those thoughts with me? Because I'd love to hear them. If you have anything you'd like to say, please do leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I will see you next time for something different, and I hope you have the loveliest of days.